The cowboy helped a forgotten Apache girl. 15 years later, she returned with an army of warriors. Sterling Rhodes was fixing his fence when he heard the horses. Not just any horses, dozens of them, moving in perfect formation across the valley toward his ranch. He squinted against the morning sun, expecting to see the familiar faces of neighboring ranchers or perhaps merchants from town. Instead, what he saw made no sense at all. Apache warriors, an entire war party, painted for battle, riding in disciplined silence toward his property. But this was impossible. The Apache hadn't been seen in these parts for over a decade. The treaties, the forced relocations, everyone knew they were gone for good. Sterling's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but something stopped him cold. At the front of the formation rode a woman, her face partially hidden by traditional war paint, but her eyes, those eyes were staring directly at him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine, as if she knew him, as if she had been looking for him specifically. The war party stopped exactly 50 yards from his fence, close enough to strike, but far enough to wait. Sterling had lived on the frontier long enough to know that Apache war parties didn't stop to chat. They attacked swiftly, decisively, and without warning. Yet here they were, motionless as statues, all eyes on their female leader, as she continued to study him with those hauntingly familiar eyes. Then she did something that broke every rule Sterling thought he knew about Apache warfare. She dismounted, alone, and began walking toward him, her hands visible and empty, in what could only be described as a gesture of peace. But that wasn't the strangest part. As she drew closer, Sterling's breath caught in his throat, because somewhere buried deep in his memory, he recognized those eyes. Eyes he hadn't seen in 15 long years. Eyes that belonged to someone who couldn't possibly be standing in front of him right now. The woman stopped just outside his fence and spoke a single word that made Sterling's world tilt on its axis. Sterling. She knew his name. But more than that, she said it like someone who had been carrying it in her heart for a very long time. Sterling's mind raced as he stared at the woman before him. 15 years was a long time, but some faces never fade from memory. Some debts never truly disappear. The woman standing at his fence wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with modern leather accessories. War paint covered half her face, but it couldn't hide the scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw. A scar Sterling remembered all too well. This was Ayanna, the barely alive 12-year-old girl he had found bleeding and unconscious near the creek behind his property 15 years ago. "You remember?" she said quietly, watching recognition dawn in his eyes. Her English was flawless now, with barely a trace of accent. "Good. I wasn't certain you would." Sterling's throat felt dry as dust. "Ayanna. But how?" "The soldiers said your people were relocated, all of them, to the reservation lands in Oklahoma Territory." A bitter smile crossed her lips. "The soldiers said many things. Most were lies." She gestured toward the mounted warriors behind her. "These men are not from Oklahoma Territory. They are from 7 different tribes united under one purpose." Sterling's eyes swept over the war party again, this time noticing details he had missed before. The warriors weren't all Apache. Different tribal markings, different weapons, different styles of dress. This wasn't a tribal war party. It was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist. "What purpose?" Sterling asked, though part of him feared the answer. "Justice," Ayanna replied simply, "but not the kind you might expect." She reached into a leather pouch at her side and withdrew something that made Sterling's blood turn to ice. It was a piece of paper, official-looking, with several wax seals along the bottom. Even from a distance he could see the letterhead, Whitman Trading Company, Legal Division. 3 days ago, Elias Whitman filed a claim against your ranch, Ayanna said, holding up the document. "He says you owe him $800 in unpaid debts, money supposedly borrowed 2 years ago for cattle feed and winter supplies." Sterling's jaw tightened. "That's a lie. I've never borrowed a cent from Whitman or anyone else. I pay cash for everything." "I know," Ayanna said calmly. Because I've spent the last 2 years investigating Elias Whitman and his business practices. This is the 17th ranch he's tried to claim using forged debt papers. The other 16 families, they weren't as fortunate as you're about to be. Sterling felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. This wasn't a social visit or a nostalgic reunion. This was something much more complex and infinitely more dangerous. What happened to the other 16 families? He asked, though he suspected he already knew. Ayanna's eyes hardened. They lost everything. Their land, their homes, their livestock. Whitman has a very convincing lawyer and a judge who asks no questions. She paused, letting that sink in. But he made one critical mistake when he chose your ranch. What mistake? He chose to steal from the one man who saved my life. And that, Ayanna said, is a debt I can never let go unpaid. The weight of Ayanna's words settled over Sterling like a heavy blanket. He had always known Elias Whitman was ruthless, but this level of systematic theft was beyond anything he had imagined. How do you know all this? Sterling asked, studying Ayanna's face. The scared, broken child he had nursed back to health was gone, replaced by someone who radiated quiet authority and dangerous intelligence. Because after you saved me, I didn't disappear into nothing, Ayanna replied. I learned. I studied. I became everything I needed to become to survive in both worlds, yours and mine. She gestured toward her warriors. These men follow me not because of bloodline or tradition. They follow me because I've given them something more valuable than anything Whitman could offer, which is purpose and the skills to achieve it. Ayanna's expression grew serious. I didn't just vanish 15 years ago, Sterling. I went east, to schools in St. Louis and Chicago. I learned law, business, strategy. I discovered how men like Whitman operate, how they use legal papers and corrupt officials to steal what doesn't belong to them. Sterling felt his world shifting again. The little Apache girl he remembered couldn't read English, could barely speak it. Now she stood before him discussing legal strategy with the confidence of a trained professional. So what exactly are you proposing? He asked. Tomorrow morning, Whitman plans to arrive here with Sheriff Morrison and a court order to seize your property, Ayanna said. They expect you to be alone, defenseless, with no way to prove the debt papers are forged. Sterling's stomach dropped. Tomorrow was Saturday. The bank wouldn't be open. No way to gather witnesses or documentation. It was perfectly planned. But you're not going to be alone, Ayanna continued, because I have something Whitman doesn't know exists. She whistled sharply, and one of the warriors approached carrying a leather satchel. From the satchel, Ayanna withdrew a thick folder of documents. Depositions from the 16 families Whitman has cheated, copies of the original loan agreements, the real ones, before they were altered, bank records showing the forgeries, and sworn testimony from a clerk in Whitman's office who grew tired of being part of his schemes. Sterling stared at the documents in amazement. This is enough to destroy him. It's enough to do more than that, Ayanna said grimly. But first, we need to let him make his move. Let him reveal himself completely before we spring the trap. And if something goes wrong? If the sheriff sides with him despite the evidence? Ayanna glanced back at her warriors, and Sterling caught something cold and final in her expression. Then we move to a different kind of justice. The kind that doesn't require courts or judges. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Sterling realized that this woman, this leader of warriors from multiple tribes, hadn't just come to help him fight a legal battle. She had come prepared for war if necessary. There's something else you need to know, Ayanna said quietly. Whitman didn't choose your ranch randomly. He knows about that day 15 years ago. He knows you helped me, and he's been planning this revenge ever since. Sterling's blood went cold. How could he possibly know that? Because, Ayanna said, someone told him. Sterling's mind reeled as he tried to process Ayanna's words. Someone had told Whitman about that day 15 years ago. Someone who knew he had helped an Apache girl recover from her wounds in secret. Who? Sterling demanded, his voice hoarse. Who could have known? Ayana's expression grew pained. Dr. Harrison, the town physician you brought to treat me when my fever got too high. The name hit Sterling like a physical blow. Dr. Marcus Harrison had been his friend, the only person in town he had trusted enough to help save Ayana's life. Harrison had sworn an oath of secrecy, had promised that no one would ever know about the wounded Apache girl. Harrison's been dead for 3 years, Sterling said numbly. Yes, but before he died, he confessed to his son about many things that weighed on his conscience, Ayana explained, including the night he helped save an Apache girl at your ranch. Young Dr. Harrison inherited his father's practice, and with it, all his father's debts to Elias Whitman. Sterling felt sick. So he sold the information to pay off what he owed. More than that, he provided Whitman with detailed knowledge of your property, your habits, your finances. Everything Whitman needed to plan this theft perfectly. Ayana's jaw tightened. But what young Dr. Harrison didn't know was that his father had kept detailed records of that night. Medical notes, sketches of my injuries, even a pressed flower from the medicine plants you gathered to help heal me. Sterling remembered those plants. Wild herbs that grew near the creek. Traditional remedies Ayana had whispered to him in her delirium. He had spent hours gathering them, following her fevered instructions because it was the only hope she had. Those records are going to save you, Ayana continued, because they prove beyond doubt that I was near death when you found me. No healthy Apache warrior would have been in that condition. The injuries documented show I was a victim, not a threat. Why does that matter legally? Because Whitman's plan depends on portraying you as an Indian sympathizer who harbored a dangerous fugitive. He intends to use anti-Apache sentiment in town to justify seizing your property as punishment for treason against civilized society. Ayana's voice carried cold anger. But Dr. Harrison's records prove you saved a dying child, not harbored a warrior. Sterling stared at her in amazement. You've thought of everything. I've had 15 years to think about it, Ayana replied. 15 years to plan for the day I could repay what you did for me. But there's something else. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Young Dr. Harrison isn't just Whitman's informant. He's also his business partner. What do you mean? The 16 families Whitman cheated? After he seized their properties, someone had to tend to the family's medical needs when they became desperate. Dr. Harrison provided those services, often in exchange for the remaining personal belongings the families had left. Ayana's eyes flashed with righteous fury. They created a system. Whitman steals the land, Harrison profits from the misery that follows. Sterling felt rage building in his chest. 2 men he had trusted, father and son, had betrayed everything decent about their professions. Tomorrow, when Whitman arrives with Sheriff Morrison, Dr. Harrison will be with them, Ayana said. He'll claim you're mentally unstable from living alone too long, that you're imagining persecution that doesn't exist. His medical testimony will support Whitman's legal claim. And you're going to stop them? We're going to stop them, Ayana corrected, but not the way they expect. She whistled again, and another warrior approached with a different satchel. From this one, Ayana withdrew something that made Sterling's eyes widen. A medical bag, identical to the one Dr. Harrison carried. Tell me, Sterling, Ayana said with a slight smile. How much do you remember about those medicinal plants you gathered for me 15 years ago? Sterling stared at the medical bag in Ayana's hands. Memories flooding back. Those desperate nights 15 years ago when he had crushed willow bark for fever, gathered prairie sage for infection, and mixed chamomile tea to help her sleep through the pain. I remember some of it, he said slowly. But I'm no doctor. No, but you learned more about traditional medicine that week than most physicians learn in years, Ayana replied. And unlike them, you learned from someone whose life depended on getting it right. She opened the medical bag, revealing not the typical doctor's instruments, but carefully labeled bottles of plant extracts and dried herbs. I've spent 15 years studying both worlds of healing, traditional Apache knowledge and modern medical science. This bag contains remedies that are completely natural, but produce very specific effects. Sterling examined the contents. Everything looked legitimate, like something a frontier doctor might carry. What kind of effects? Temporary ones, harmless but very convincing symptoms that will expose Whitman and Dr. Harrison for what they really are. Ayanna selected a small brown bottle. This is concentrated extract from the root of the wild potato plant. In small doses it causes intense but brief stomach upset, cramping, nausea, sweating, symptoms that mimic serious illness. You want to poison them? I want to reveal their true nature, Ayanna corrected. When Whitman arrives tomorrow morning, we're going to offer them coffee as any polite host would. The coffee will be treated with just enough extract to make them uncomfortable. Sterling began to understand. And then? Then we see what happens when Dr. Harrison is asked to treat genuinely sick patients, including his own business partner. Will he provide proper medical care? Or will he be more concerned about completing their fraudulent business? It was brilliant. If Harrison treated Whitman properly, it would prove he was a competent doctor who could recognize real illness. But if he ignored Whitman's symptoms, or dismissed them, it would demonstrate his priority wasn't medical care, but financial gain. But what about Sheriff Morrison? He's not part of their scheme, just following what he thinks is legal procedure. Exactly. Which is why the sheriff will be the key witness to everything that happens. Ayanna's eyes gleamed with strategic thinking. When Morrison sees Dr. Harrison fail to properly treat his own business partner, he'll start questioning everything else about their relationship. Sterling nodded slowly. And that's when you present the evidence about the forged documents. Not just the documents. I have something better. Ayanna reached into the bag again and withdrew a leather journal. This belonged to the clerk in Whitman's office, the one who kept records of all the forgeries. Before he disappeared, he gave this to me. It contains details of every illegal transaction, every bribed official, every family they cheated. Sterling opened the journal and whistled softly. Page after page of meticulous records. Dates, amounts, even sketches of the forged seals Whitman used. It was more than evidence. It was a complete confession. Why did this clerk help you? Because Whitman cheated his family too. His elderly parents lost their farm to the same scheme 3 years ago. Ayanna's voice carried deep sadness. The clerk tried to make things right from the inside, but Whitman discovered his efforts. That's when he came to me. Where is he now? Safe, hidden among my people until this is finished. Ayanna closed the journal carefully. But Sterling, there's something else you need to know. Something that changes everything about tomorrow. Sterling felt his stomach tighten. What? Whitman isn't planning to just seize your ranch and leave. According to the clerk's notes, he intends to make an example of you. A public demonstration of what happens to anyone who helps Apache people. Ayanna's expression grew grave. He's planning to burn your ranch house down after the seizure. With you inside if necessary. The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. This wasn't just theft. It was attempted murder, disguised as legal procedure. The clerk wrote that Whitman has been telling people you're dangerous. That you're planning to attack the town with Apache allies. Tomorrow's seizure is meant to look like preventive justice. Ayanna met his eyes directly. He never intended for you to survive this. Sterling. Sterling felt cold fury building in his chest. Then we'd better make sure our plan works perfectly. It will, Ayanna said firmly. But only if you're prepared for the possibility that words and evidence might not be enough. Are you ready for that? Sterling looked out at the mounted warriors waiting silently in the distance, then back at Ayanna's determined face. I've been ready for 15 years. Dawn broke gray and cold over Sterling's ranch. Ayanna and her warriors had withdrawn to positions in the hills before sunrise, invisible but close enough to intervene if needed. Only Ayanna remained, hidden in Sterling's barn with the medical bag and crucial evidence. Sterling had barely finished his morning coffee when he heard the approaching horses. 3 riders, Sheriff Morrison in his official vest, Dr. Harrison carrying his medical bag, and Elias Whitman dressed in an expensive suit that looked absurd in the frontier setting. "Good morning, Sterling," Sheriff Morrison called out as they dismounted. His tone was apologetic but firm. "I'm afraid I have some unpleasant business to discuss with you." Sterling stepped out onto his porch. appearing calm despite the tension coiling in his stomach. "Morning, Sheriff, gentlemen. Can I offer you some coffee? Just brewed a fresh pot." Whitman's eyes gleamed with anticipated victory. "How thoughtful." "Yes, coffee would be welcome." Sterling disappeared inside briefly, returning with a tray containing 4 cups of steaming coffee. He had prepared the drinks exactly as Ayanna instructed, 3 normal cups, and 1 treated with the wild potato extract. The treated cup had a small chip on the handle, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. "Here you go," Sterling said, deliberately handing the chipped cup to Whitman. "Sugar's already in them." The men accepted their coffee gratefully. Dr. Harrison looked nervous, avoiding Sterling's eyes. Sheriff Morrison appeared genuinely uncomfortable with his duty. Only Whitman seemed confident, sipping his coffee while studying Sterling like a predator examining wounded prey. "Now then," Sheriff Morrison began, "Mr. Whitman here claims you owe him a substantial sum of money, $800 to be exact. He has documentation showing you borrowed this amount 2 years ago for cattle feed and winter supplies." Sterling shook his head firmly. "That's completely false, Sheriff. I've never borrowed money from Mr. Whitman or anyone else. I keep careful records of all my transactions. Do you have receipts proving you paid cash for your supplies, Doctor?" Harrison asked, speaking for the first time. "Of course I do. They're inside." "How convenient," Whitman said with a smirk. "Papers that could easily be forged after the fact." Sheriff Morrison frowned. "Now hold on, Elias. Sterling's word has always been good in this town." "Has it?" Whitman challenged. "Sheriff, are you aware that Mr. Rhodes here has a history of harboring dangerous fugitives?" Sterling felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. "What are you talking about? 15 years ago, you provided aid and comfort to an Apache warrior who was wounded during a raid on civilian settlements." Whitman's voice carried the righteous indignation of a practiced liar. "Dr. Harrison's father documented the entire incident." Dr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably. "My father's notes indicate medical treatment was provided to an Apache individual at this ranch." "A child," Sterling said firmly. "A wounded child who would have died without help. A potential threat to the entire community," Whitman countered. "By your own admission, you harbored a hostile Apache on your property." Sheriff Morrison looked confused. "Sterling, is this true? You never mentioned anything about this." Before Sterling could answer, Whitman suddenly doubled over, his face going pale. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he clutched his stomach. "Something's wrong," he gasped. "I feel terrible." Dr. Harrison immediately set down his coffee cup and moved toward Whitman. But Sterling noticed something strange. Instead of examining his patient, Harrison glanced nervously at Sheriff Morrison, as if calculating how his next actions would appear. "What's wrong with him?" Sheriff Morrison demanded. I'm not sure," Dr. Harrison stammered, pulling out a stethoscope with shaking hands. "Mr. Whitman, can you describe your symptoms?" Whitman was now sweating profusely, his expensive suit wilting. "Cramping, nausea, feels like food poisoning." Sterling watched Dr. Harrison's reaction carefully. A competent physician would immediately suspect the coffee, would ask about other foods consumed, would check Whitman's pulse and temperature. Instead, Harrison seemed more concerned about the legal documents in Whitman's coat pocket than his patient's condition. "Perhaps we should postpone this business," Sheriff Morrison suggested, genuinely concerned. "No!" Whitman gasped through his discomfort. "We finish this now. The papers, the seizure order." And that's when Ayanna emerged from the barn, carrying Dr. Harrison's father's medical journal and the clerk's evidence. Her timing was perfect, just as Dr. Harrison's priorities became crystal clear to everyone present. "Sheriff Morrison," she called out in a clear, authoritative voice. "I have information about this case that you need to see immediately." Sheriff Morrison's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon when he saw Ayanna approaching, but something in her calm, measured stride made him pause. This wasn't the posture of someone planning violence. "Who are you?" Morrison demanded, though his tone was more curious than threatening. "My name is Ayanna." I'm the Apache child Sterling saved 15 years ago. She held up the medical journal and the clerk's evidence. And I have proof that Mr. Whitman and Dr. Harrison are attempting to steal this ranch through fraudulent means. Dr. Harrison's face went white. That's impossible. You can't be. She was just a child. Children grow up. Doctor. Especially when they're given the chance to live. Ayanna's gaze was steady and unforgiving. Your father's medical records document every detail of my treatment, including the fact that I was a wounded child, not a warrior, and that Sterling Rhodes saved my life through an act of pure compassion. Whitman still doubled over in pain, snarled through gritted teeth. Sheriff, arrest her. She's a fugitive. A dangerous... A what? Ayanna interrupted, opening Dr. Harrison's father's journal. According to these medical notes, I was 12 years old, suffered from 3 broken ribs, a severe head wound, and infection from untreated injuries. Hardly the profile of a dangerous warrior. Sheriff Morrison accepted the journal and began reading. His expression grew more troubled with each page. These notes describe a child who was near death. What kind of raid were you supposedly part of? There was no raid, Ayanna said firmly. I was attacked by 3 men who found me gathering medicinal plants near the creek. They left me for dead because they assumed no one would care about one missing Apache girl. Dr. Harrison had been kneeling beside Whitman, but Sterling noticed he hadn't actually performed any meaningful medical examination. No checking of pulse, no questions about onset of symptoms, no attempt to determine the cause of the illness. Doctor, Sheriff Morrison said sharply, shouldn't you be more concerned about your patient's condition? Doctor. Harrison fumbled with his stethoscope. Of course, The accusations are so shocking. More shocking than a man suffering what appears to be severe food poisoning? Ayanna asked pointedly. In my experience with traditional medicine, these symptoms suggest consumption of something harmful. Shouldn't you be asking what he ate or drank recently? The implication hung in the air. A competent doctor would immediately suspect the coffee, but Dr. Harrison seemed reluctant to investigate too thoroughly. Sheriff Morrison's eyes narrowed as he observed the young doctor's strange behavior. Let me see those debt papers, Morrison demanded, extending his hand toward Whitman. Whitman clutched his coat protectively, even through his obvious discomfort. The papers are legal and binding. Ayanna produced the clerk's journal. Sheriff, this contains detailed records of how Mr. Whitman creates fraudulent debt documents. The process, the forged seals, even the names of officials he's bribed to validate false claims. Morrison opened the clerk's journal, and his jaw dropped. Page after page of meticulous documentation, including sketches of the exact seals used on Whitman's fraudulent papers. The handwriting was clear, the dates precise, the details damning. Where did you get this? Morrison asked. From a clerk in Whitman's office who grew tired of being part of a criminal enterprise. He documented everything before fleeing to safety. Ayanna met Morrison's eyes directly. 16 families have lost their ranches to this exact scheme. Sterling's ranch was supposed to be number 17. Dr. Harrison finally seemed to realize the gravity of his situation. Sheriff, I had no idea about any fraudulent activities. I was simply following my professional duty. Your professional duty? Ayanna challenged. Then why haven't you properly examined your patient? Why haven't you asked about possible causes of his symptoms? Any competent physician would immediately suspect poisoning and want to identify the source. Morrison looked from Harrison to Whitman, to the evidence in his hands. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was ugly beyond belief. Mr. Whitman, Morrison said slowly, I think we need to have a very different conversation. Starting with why you're so eager to complete this business transaction while you're supposedly suffering from severe illness. Whitman's eyes darted desperately between the sheriff and the evidence. Sweat poured down his face, but Sterling could see calculation behind the pain. The man was cornered, and cornered animals were most dangerous. You don't understand, Whitman gasped. This isn't over. Even if these papers are questioned, there are others who support my claim. Important people who won't let this—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the threat was clear. And that's when they heard the sound that changed everything. Horses approaching from multiple directions, moving fast and with purpose. Sheriff Morrison drew his weapon, but Ayanna simply smiled. "Those aren't enemies, Sheriff. Those are the other families Whitman cheated. I sent word yesterday that today was the day we finally brought him to justice." The riders approaching weren't Apache warriors. They were families. 16 groups of men, women, and children on horses. In wagons, some on foot. All of them had one thing in common: the hard, determined expressions of people who had lost everything and finally found a chance for justice. Sheriff Morrison holstered his weapon as he recognized several faces. "Tom Bradley, Sarah Hutchins, what are you all doing here?" An older man with calloused hands and worn clothes stepped forward. "We're here because that woman," he pointed to Ayanna, "sent word that the man who stole our farms was finally going to face justice. Now see here, Dr. Harrison stammered. "These people are clearly mistaken about—" "Mistaken?" A woman with 3 small children clinging to her skirts spoke up. "Doctor, you were there when Mr. Whitman seized our property. You examined my husband and declared him unfit to make financial decisions, remember? Right after he refused to sign over our deed voluntarily." Sheriff Morrison turned to Dr. Harrison with growing suspicion. "You declared people mentally unfit to support Whitman's claims?" Dr. Harrison's face flushed red. "I provided honest medical assessments when requested." "Honest?" Tom Bradley laughed bitterly. "You said I was suffering from frontier dementia because I couldn't remember borrowing money I never borrowed. Then Whitman used your diagnosis to have me declared incompetent in court." Ayanna stepped forward, still holding the clerk's journal. "Sheriff, page 43 documents the exact process. Dr. Harrison would declare landowners mentally unstable. Whitman would present forged debt papers, and Judge Caldwell would rubber stamp the seizures." Morrison flipped to the indicated page and read aloud. "Standard procedure. Harrison declares debtor mentally compromised due to isolation or stress. Caldwell accepts medical testimony without independent verification. Property transfer completed within 24 hours to prevent appeals." The families pressed closer, their anger palpable but controlled. These weren't vigilantes seeking revenge. They were citizens demanding justice through proper legal channels. Whitman, still suffering from the effects of the plant extract, tried to stand but stumbled. "This is all fabricated nonsense. These people are simply bitter about legitimate business transactions." "Legitimate?" Sarah Hutchins held up a piece of paper. "Then explain why the signature on this supposed loan agreement doesn't match my husband's handwriting." I brought samples of his real signature for comparison. One by one, the families began producing evidence they had gathered over the years. Letters with authentic signatures that didn't match the supposed loan documents. Receipts showing they had paid cash for supplies Whitman claimed they had purchased on credit. Testimonies from neighbors who witnessed their transactions. Sheriff Morrison stared at the mounting evidence in amazement. "How did you all gather this information?" "She helped us," Tom Bradley said, nodding toward Ayanna. "Spent 2 years tracking us down, helping us organize our evidence, teaching us about legal procedures. She said we needed to be prepared when the right moment came." Ayanna met Sterling's eyes. "I told you I learned about both worlds, yours and mine. I learned that justice requires more than anger. It requires evidence, organization, and the right moment to act." Dr. Harrison made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Sheriff, even if there are questions about Mr. Whitman's business practices, that doesn't change the fact that Sterling harbored a dangerous fugitive, a 12-year-old child who was dying from her injuries," Ayanna interrupted firmly. "Your father's medical records prove that conclusively, unless you're claiming your father was incompetent or dishonest." The trap was perfect. Dr. Harrison couldn't discredit his father's medical documentation without destroying his own professional credibility. And he couldn't support the documentation without admitting that Sterling had saved an innocent child, not harbored a dangerous fugitive. Sheriff Morrison looked around at the assembled crowd. The evidence. and the two men who had tried to manipulate him. His decision was clear. Elias Whitman, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit theft. Dr. Harrison, you're under arrest as an accessory to these crimes. Morrison began pulling out his handcuffs. The seizure order is hereby declared invalid pending a full investigation. Whitman's face contorted with rage despite his physical discomfort. You have no idea what you're doing, Morrison. There are powerful people who support my business interests. This isn't over. But as he looked around at the 16 families, at Ayanna's calm confidence, and at the overwhelming evidence against him, even Whitman seemed to realize that this time, it truly was over. The debt of honor that began 15 years ago with a dying Apache child was finally, completely paid. 3 months later, Sterling stood on his porch, watching the sunrise paint the valley gold. His ranch was secure, his reputation restored, and his future brighter than it had been in years. The trials of Elias Whitman and Dr. Harrison had concluded the previous week. Whitman received 15 years in territorial prison for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Judge Caldwell, revealed as his co-conspirator, was removed from the bench and faced his own criminal charges. Dr. Harrison lost his medical license and received 5 years imprisonment as an accessory to the crimes. More importantly, all 16 families had their properties legally restored. The territorial court, embarrassed by the scope of the corruption, expedited the process and provided financial compensation for their losses. Tom Bradley was already rebuilding his barn. Sarah Hutchins had reopened her small store in town. Sterling heard horses approaching and smiled. Ayanna visited weekly now, sometimes alone, sometimes with members of her confederation. Today she rode alone, as she had that first morning 3 months ago. "Good morning," she called out, dismounting near his fence. "Morning, Ayanna. Coffee?" "Always." They sat on his porch in comfortable silence, watching the valley come alive with morning light. The relationship between them had evolved into something Sterling had never expected. Genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "I received a letter from the territorial capital yesterday," Ayanna said. "They're offering me a position as liaison between tribal governments and territorial courts. Official recognition of my legal training." Sterling raised his eyebrows. "That's a significant honor. Will you accept?" "I'm considering it. The work I've been doing, helping families fight corruption, organizing legal challenges to fraudulent claims, it could become much more effective with official backing." She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "But it would mean spending more time in offices and courtrooms, less time riding free across the territory. Sounds like you're torn between two worlds again." "No," Ayanna said with a slight smile. "I think I've finally learned that I don't have to choose between worlds. I can bridge them." She gestured toward the valley where smoke rose from the chimneys of restored homesteads. "These families aren't just Apache or white settlers anymore. They're people who stood together against injustice. That's a new kind of community." Sterling nodded, understanding. "And what about your warriors? The confederation you built? They're not going anywhere. We've proven that different tribes can unite for common cause. That's a powerful thing in these changing times." Ayanna's expression grew serious. "But the confederation was always about more than warfare. It was about protection, justice, and ensuring our people have a voice in their own future." "Speaking of the future," Sterling said, "I've been thinking about expanding my operation, maybe getting into horse breeding. I could use a partner who understands both traditional methods and modern business practices." Ayanna looked at him with surprise. "Are you offering me a business partnership?" "I'm offering you a chance to put down roots while still keeping your freedom. Equal partnership, shared decisions, shared profits." Sterling met her eyes directly. 15 years ago, you needed someone to believe in your right to survive. Now I'm asking if you believe in my vision for what this place could become." For a moment, Ayanna was quiet, processing the offer. Then she extended her hand. "Partners." They shook hands, sealing an agreement that felt like the completion of a circle begun 15 years ago with a dying child and a compassionate cowboy. "You know," Ayanna said, When I was 12 and barely alive, I made myself a promise. If I survived, if I grew strong, I would find a way to repay the man who saved me. You did that months ago when you stopped Whitman." "No," Ayanna said firmly. "Stopping Whitman was justice. Building something lasting together, this is the real repayment. This is how we honor what began that night you chose compassion over fear." Sterling looked out over his land, soon to be their land, and smiled. 15 years ago, I thought I was just helping someone who needed help." "You were," Ayanna replied. "But sometimes helping one person changes everything else. Sometimes one act of kindness ripples forward in ways you never imagine." As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in brilliant blues, Sterling Rhodes and Ayanna began planning their future together. The cowboy who had helped a forgotten Apache girl had discovered that some debts of honor never truly end. They simply transform into something richer and more lasting than either person could have achieved alone. The valley spread before them, full of possibilities neither had dared imagine when this story began. And in that moment, both knew that the best was yet to come. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.